Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, why they work, and why we love them. Today, I am Anonymous Squirrel, which is probably the lamest of the anonymous animals I've been. I can't really
Yeah,
think back to all of them. We'd have to go back, but I remember this was one of the first times where I've been like, oh, cool.
disappointing.
Yeah. Lovely. Um, Today, we will be talking about. Well, I'm Greg.
I'm
With me
Mark.
is Mark.
Yes,
There we
hello.
go. Yeah, yeah. Almost missed the bare minimum level of introduction that we do, um, which is intentional, by the way. It'd be very easy for Mark and I just to sit here and chat, but that's not why you're listening. So, why you are listening is for the topic of the week, which was we were thinking about. Doing, continuing on with time stuff, which we'll probably do at some point in games and all the different kind of ways to look at that topic. But instead, we were going into a thought that Mark had last week about competition, and we're going back to kind of esports, which is something I don't think we've really touched on the cast since the very beginning, like
Yeah, it's been a
last
while.
May or so. There might be a couple of things that we rehash a little bit here, but in large part, we had a pretty good discussion about it started and then just kind of built organically. So in large part, we're just going to be talking about um, competition and a lot of the different things that go into it, and some of the ideals and the different factors that cause competition to go one way or the other in video games. So it kind of started by thinking about the difference, the globalization of games, right? You want to
Right.
talk about that for a sec?
Yeah. So the motivating incident, and I'm constantly scanning my own life for interesting phenomenon relating to video games because I do this podcast, and
You do
me,
that anyway.
yeah, it's true. But me and one of my roommates we have a very good healthy rivalry playing the 64 Smash, Super Smash Brothers, the original, and we are evenly matched, like almost dead even. He'll have days where he does well, I'll have days where I do well, but it goes back and forth pretty consistently. And there's little evolutions that have happened. I always play Kirby, he always plays Ness, and the most recent evolution has been I've started to, when it comes down to one-on-one, because we often start with computers, I will suck him up and take his lightning power and then use that, and that has sort of thrown him off enough to give me the edge in a lot of the one-on-one stuff. But anyway,
Oh, nice.
yeah, that's sort of tangential, but
Well, that's
that's
interesting though, because it really depends. Then your own meta shifts into you having to be able to get that first power steal.
yeah,
Otherwise, and then the game shifts. So even outside of like who's better, then the beginning of every game will become you trying to figure out how to do that, and him trying to figure out how to not let you do that.
yeah,
Which is a really interesting little tiny small pond meta that
yeah.
developed, which is kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, we're talking about a meta evolution, but one of the things I realized that I was free from because I play primarily with my roommates and maybe with some of his friends, but they're not particularly skilled. They aren't evenly matched with us, so I'm mostly just concerned with one other person's skill level. And I realized that I was free from the dynamic that occurs in things like games like Overwatch, or PUBG or Fortnite, where you're playing online with a global pool. I'm not worried about Sam like practicing for hundreds of hours while I'm not looking. Like if he
Hmm.
got really serious about trying to like become a professional Smash player, I would know about it, and I would, if I wanted to keep playing with him, I would have to follow suit.
Right.
What happens with games that do occur over the internet and more globally are you, because you're playing against random people all the time. The average does move. The average Overwatch player, I would say, is much more skilled at Overwatch now than they were when the game first came out.
Sure.
I don't really think that's a controversial claim, and so those people, if you're not playing Overwatch, then the odds of you uh, falling out of average are increased. Um,
Yeah.
Go
Well,
on.
and even more, just when you first floated this topic, it just made me think more so of like the phenomenon that we got to live through in large part, which was before online gaming was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
and the way that you would play. I actually remember the few online games you did play, or like the few times I would like somehow link up and try. I remember one afternoon when I was a kid trying to play Age of Empires 2 online, and just getting bodied by something I'd never thought of before, right? Like some strategy, it was probably ridiculous cheese, but something that I'd never, like when you don't have literally anyone else to play with, you develop your own meta for a game that probably sucks, honestly. I doubt anyone just naturally, particularly as kids, were just figured out the ideal way to play a game,
Right.
not against humans. In fact, you even just adapt for the computers in the campaign. So of course you're not going to be good against humans, even if you did like perfectly adapt to the campaign. Um, anyway, point is, it just there's something that happened where you realized, even with like my little cul-de-sac group I grew up with, I had kind of a stand by me Goonies-esque group of kids that we kind of grew up with in the summers. That was pretty ridiculous. Very lucky, but we would play Smash. That was Melee. We had one kid with a GameCube, and obviously the guy who owned it was the best, and then the other guys who had more access to the game were better, and then the people who only played when we came over and played with David were the worst.
Right.
And and it was funny because I remember the kid who had David was the best, and he played Samus all the time. And this is before obviously anyone had any inkling of meta, or any of us did had any inkling of meta or anything like that. But the second best guy always played Kirby. Kirby is like considered trash in Melee.
Yeah, he's not
And he
good.
gets Yeah, exactly. But in my mind, I always thought of Samus and Kirby as two of the best characters. You
Hmm.
know, so it was it's a very relative thing that then when the internet came in and suddenly you're able to play against not only like you said, there was this baseline, right? And of course that goes with a game's lifespan, but in general, even just people that would have learned the multiplayer at all are so much better at a game than people who have never even touched a multiplayer, even if they've played the game a lot.
Right.
So it is a extreme sense of big fish in small pond when you go online and suddenly get absolutely bodied. And we talked about this, I think, in one of the first episodes, but it's because basically you bring the limit on amount of time and amount of people to maximum in terms
Right.
of like figuring out and solving game.
Right.
Um, Developers can't make a game complicated enough that would require the whole world's population to be playing it and to figure it out. Um,
Right. When you've got
that'll just happen
several thousand brains working to try and figure out that optimal way to play, like you're going to see some improvement on that.
over
Like,
thousands of hours. Yeah,
right? I mean, that's how a real, concrete, meaningful in the economic sense disciplines are advanced, right? Is like the
yeah,
same sort of thing. You get
right,
people all thinking about something.
right. So that interesting that brought us to talk about just kind of like local optimization then, and that question of how you what that means and how to do that, and
Well, I think
or what the question that's begged is.
what you brought up about how you would only get so good playing locally, I think has to do with this phenomenon of finding sort of a local maximum, right? It might not be
Mm,
the global optimal way to play, but locally it's good enough. Like, is sucking up Ness with Kirby in a 1v1 like the best move to do? I don't know. It probably isn't, would be my guess. But it throws
yeah,
off my roommate enough to give me an edge, and that's what matters to me right now because he's my opponent. And so these very small pools, while they can be satisfying, and you don't have the stress of wondering, oh gosh, is so and so going to get a lot better than me overnight? You do end up with a very localized solution to the problems you encounter,
yeah,
because you aren't facing a pool that's very diverse, like you do if you're playing online randomized matches. You don't have to really come up with the most optimal solution globally. You can sort of just settle for one that's good locally.
yeah. That's an interesting thought too that I hadn't thought of until right now. In terms of not only are you limiting your just the sheer scale of how good people can be, but you're also massively limiting the diversity of game types that you're playing, right? So like you are playing a single person with a single skill set, which of course is adaptable and movable, but in general that is the problem that you have to solve when you
Hmm.
queue into matchmaking, be that be 1v1 or in a larger team based game. Obviously, more so with a team based game, but you not only are we'll get into matchmaking in a second, but in general, you're getting a semi-randomized version of skill, but also you're getting a completely randomized
Mm.
version of the way they're going to play the game in general,
Right.
or their strategy. There's as long assuming different strategies being generally skill locked or similar in terms of skill, like being able to allow you to advance to the same level. You're completely randomizing player type and general uh, play style, which is that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, so globally,
You can never adapt unless you stick in a lobby with someone. I mean,
yeah, you mean like adapt to the other person's play style?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's true. And I
very
think that
different than
those are
your
very
top
related.
competitive levels, which you can see players preparing for other players. They learn the player, they learn not just the matchup in terms of the game or the character or whatever it is, but their opponent and the way they think. That's why you see great gaming rivalries.
And the same thing happens in sports too. I mean, you watch videos of the other team and how they play, and so it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a battle of the minds between the coaches of, okay, how well do I know my opponent in this matchup? And
Mm-hmm.
um, with video games, I think you're right to point out that like your approach, the number of different approaches you're going to encounter with a localized playing pool is much lower, and that actually inhibits the evolution rate and the discovery of new metas
Mm-hmm.
because you have less people sort of looking at the search space of all possibilities, right? If you think about your the meta could be anything in this game, right? It could
Right.
be almost any approach, and there are literally millions, if not, there could be a lot of zeros after that. There are a lot of approaches to
Right.
different things in the game, and the more people you have sort of exploring that search space and trying different things, the odds of one of them bumping into a strategy that's really, really good goes way up. And
Right.
so I think that it's not coincidental that the diversity of play styles matches up with the skill of that pool.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to the next kind of logical point in the discussion that we were having, at least, which was how do you begin? Okay, so if we have moved away from a point of localness being the mitigating factor in who you get to play with, suddenly we've opened up the internet. You now have almost unlimited people to play with, assuming a healthy online population. Um, and how do you decide who you play? Which of course is answered by matchmaking. In general, right? That'd be the competitive modes. And I actually don't know in general if you have other non-ranked modes that try to keep players like in quick play and Overwatch, if they try to really loosely group similarly leveled players together, or maybe not. I don't know. But obviously not to the same extent, and certainly not in terms of people. Hopefully, if they're playing in quick play as opposed or non-competitive modes, will care a little bit less about that. Not always the case, which is mind-boggling to me because we literally have a mode where you can go care and a mode where you can care a little bit less. But
Right.
that's a whole different phenomenon that we could talk about. But so matchmaking, right, has become far, far more advanced than it used to be. We could probably do a whole episode on the different systems and uh, Elo and like how that came. I think we even talked about how chess was kind of the beginning of MMR
Right.
um, and so on and so forth. But that's not what we're going to be doing here. I think more the interesting question with matchmaking in terms of that optimization. When you're playing alone, or not playing alone, but when you're playing in a far more localized environment, right? When you're playing with Sam and when I was playing with my friends, if I got a whole lot better somehow, right? You're talking about how that would be really hard, particularly to not let the other players know somehow
Right.
that you'd be training, a ton, particularly with your roommate in your case. But if somehow I got a ton better and quickly improved, suddenly I would be winning a lot more. It'd be very apparent to everyone that I'd gotten a lot better. I would be feeling a lot better. If you somehow leveled up and you're beating Sam like 7-3,
Right.
that's going to be really important and very obvious. Matchmaking doesn't allow you to do that basically, unless you're like really good. You start a new Smurf account, then you just tear through the rankings until you reach where you're supposed to be.
Right.
In general, for the average bear, you go in to matchmaking and you'll play. Usually, most games now I think even have placement matches. But even if you didn't, after 10 to 20 games, you'd probably be about where you're going to be. And then, if you improve, you are immediately put with people who are roughly equal to you there, and suddenly your improvement is a lot less obvious. At least it won't be reflected in win rate in so much as on a large average. The purpose of most matchmaking systems is to bring you to a perfect 50-50 win rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the expressed goal of these systems is to have you be evenly matched with people. And I think the question of what is the problem that matchmaking is trying to solve isn't a trivial one. And
Right.
it might seem like, oh, what do you mean to give people interesting matches of people who are their same skill? But if you think about actually a perfect matchmaking system where it's basically always a coin flip of whether or not you're going to win.
Right.
Isn't I don't know if I would say that it would make matches that are interesting to watch for sure, but it wouldn't give you the player a sense of having improved at the game, right? Like if it always is the same, if it feels like I've always got a 50% win rate no matter how good I get at this game, I think eventually that would feel a little discouraging. And so and thankfully, we don't have perfect systems that actually can match you up with an always perfect 50% win rate. So that might not
Right.
be like that strong of a point. But I think it just goes to show it isn't as simple as just we'll put them with the people that are the same skill level.
Well, yeah, very much. And the idea of the idea of that being able to see your skill, feeling like you're actually making improvement, right? We've basically substituted like because right in smaller localized areas there is no like recognized skill level. Skill is only defined by who gets to win on a given day and how much, right? Like like I said, I just knew the rankings in my head.
Right.
In matchmaking online, you've basically substituted that feeling because you're right. Like it is, I think it'd be a lot harder to get that visceral feeling of doing better. I mean, it's similar to actually like even like working out, where like basically you're always kind of pushing yourself unless you really stand like you're on a treadmill or something. But in general, if you just like go out jogging every day and you keep on doing that, you're always going to be kind of subconsciously pushing yourself to like the quickest version of your jog that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're always going to feel like equally tired at the end of each jog. It doesn't feel like you're getting into better shape. The reality is you're going a lot faster and your
Right.
body is functioning better, right? So that it does feel that way. But if you're always doing it, the point is basically we've substituted a feeling of like being better with like a different color medal.
Right. Yeah, like a
Um,
number or a
that's
rank.
Yeah, basically. So what you will be able to do in theory if you're getting better is you will, and the matchmaking system is good enough that it is able to correlate well to your skill increase with like a matchmaking increase. Then you will see yourself climbing the ranks, and that does feel good inherently.
Right.
And
Yeah.
those
People.
systems have definitely been very specifically built to make you feel good about movement. Even just in the way that they just the animations and the feeling of watching the stars tick up and completing bars, all that jazz, all the really simple psychological things we've talked about before,
Mm-hmm.
are really built to do that. What you don't have though is odds are it'll be similar to that jogging metaphor where you are always kind of feeling like you're playing at the maximum level that you can play and are barely just kind of getting by.
Mm-hmm.
A win is hard earned and a loss is that close. Which that's an interesting thing that we've substituted that kind of more maybe inherent or visceral feeling of improvement for something more artificial.
Yeah, we have. It's almost like so when you were talking about how we've sort of turned this into a number or a rank. I can't help but think about the economy, right? And people have for millennia now demonstrated they are in fact willing to work for a number, which is essentially how the economy functions. And so it's not that strange actually to ask people to be happy with just having a rank increase numerically.
Sure.
But it has that sort of turned into a fiat abstract quantity that sort of dictates your skill level. absent of actual experience of that skill, right? You're not like
Yeah.
just because you're level 50 or whatever, you're platinum. You're not trouncing your opponents every game because you're playing other platinum people. You don't
Exactly.
actually get to experience how much better you are than everybody else.
I remember feeling that way actually slightly when Xander and I played Overwatch. We actually played ranked. We don't anymore, but we were scrubs. We placed into silver and then we ranked into gold, climbed the ladder. And I was like kind of worried because silver was fun in that we were winning a lot more of our games than we were losing. Maybe not a ton more, but we were always usually one of the best players on the team.
Right.
Which was nice. And then we ranked into gold, and suddenly we were playing with gold and sometimes platinums, and we were far more middling. If not, I kind of felt like I was bringing up the rear, and that's a lot less fun actually.
Yeah.
Particularly when if you make these really stratified leagues like that, as opposed to say even just like a continuous number ranking. If you are in the league system, then yeah, the second that if you're close between leagues, then you're either going to be doing really well or really poorly. Playing against silvers or golds. And there's, obviously with a big enough population that begins to even out too. But at the same time, I do remember that feeling of being like, let's just kind of stay in silver and like have that 70% win rate instead of like maybe closer to like 40% in like the gold area, or
Right.
certainly if we're playing against like platinums. And so that's an interesting just phenomena as well in terms of relative player satisfaction, right? What you're playing for. We weren't playing to be competitive. We weren't playing to climb.
Right.
Like that wasn't the point. If we were truly playing to climb, then hitting gold, we would be like, fantastic, we're in gold now. That was our goal. Now we need to get to platinum.
And
But it wasn't. So,
we discussed this a little bit on one of our very first episodes about MOBAs. That may have actually been our first episode, but and that goes back to this consideration of these matchmaking systems. It's sort of built into the system that, of course, you're playing to be the best in the world, right?
Right.
Like, so we're going to
Right.
keep pushing you, like, because if your goal was to become the very best, like no one ever was. No, I'm sorry. If your goal was to be the very best, then this is the perfect program, right? You always want to be challenging yourself, exposing yourself to people who are better than you so that you can get better than them. Like, that's how that works. But some people, that's not their goal. Like, they want to have fun, they want to win a little, they want to have a good time. But, of course,
Right.
they have to use the same matchmaking systems because that's just how you find matches.
Right.
Which
Right.
was why I think the quick play distinction is nice for games that do that.
Right. Right. But you still don't have the matchmaking system also actually assume. I was just about to say, okay, so like I was gonna say, fine. Why don't you just have the same matchmaking system in ranked and in quick play? Quick play is just invisible, right? So you don't have that semblance of no one can see it, and you don't have the same level of care for all the social reasons. But that would the matchmaking system. I mean, you're right. Basically, I mean, it's just another version of what you just said in terms of it assumes you're trying to be the best. If in quick play, sometimes I'll play games where I will switch every single time I die, just to like force myself to play heroes that I wouldn't normally play. Or sometimes people do stupid strats with friends, and it's kind of trolly and whatever. That's as long as it's not super super like abusive, I think that's a fine thing to do in quick play. I think that's fun. That matchmaking systems wouldn't know what to do with that, right? They wouldn't see if they can't differentiate your intention of if you're trying to play well or if you're just throwing a little bit or doing something silly. So quick play matchmaking in that way, if you don't assume everyone actually trying, then there's no possible way to organize that, right?
That actually, yeah, no, there isn't
I have
really
no
a good way
idea
to
how you'd
organize
even.
it. And
I don't
also,
even know how you begin to.
that kind of dovetails nicely into something I wanted to bring up, which is I'm turning this idea over in my head, but I think for me an ideal matchmaking system is going to match people based on their execution skill. And
Right.
if you think about what's happening at a high level tournament, most of these people are very good at executing in the game. And by that I mean what they want to do is in fact what they are doing, right? So the things that they're trying to carry out, they're very competent to carry them out. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to win every time because what they want to do might not be optimal. It might be countered by the opponent. There's still ways to lose in that. Just because you can do what you want doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. And so then there's elements of strategy that become more pertinent. Of course, there's still execution components. Nobody's perfect. People still make mistakes, even professionals. But strategy, I think, becomes more of an aspect. It's not just about execution skill anymore. And so I think an ideal matchmaking system would match people based on their execution skill. And so that way, just like in the big leagues, these professional matches that we love watching because they are strategic and there's an execution component. If you matched people based on their execution skill, I think strategy could become a more important part of the game then. Now, unfortunately, wins and losses are the by far decided upon heuristic for determining how strategically sound or good at execution a person is. So those ideas get conflated, right? Because somebody might have a terrible strategy but sick execution, and they're going to go up in rank. And somebody might have a fantastic strategy but they have no idea what they're doing, and they're going to go down in rank because they're losing.
Right.
And I think that it would be better if people were matched with people who are as good at executing things as they are, and then you can kind of see the ideas play out.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's definitely what I tend to run into whenever I have played online games is that I tend to watch and read about games more than I play them. So my strategic knowledge tends to be very sound, and then my execution tends to be far, far less sound. In fact, it's funny, we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, but the fact that there is a kind of micro meta at the top of most competitive games, I tend to watch professional or really high level, streamers and stuff. And so would learn like Overwatch, for example, when I started playing that, and I would learn like professional strategies and comps and ideas for different maps. But that just doesn't make any sense in gold, right? Like there's no you don't at that level, you don't really require those comps. And sometimes those comps aren't even good, right? Like we could have pulled off a dive comp at gold level execution. It's super execution heavy, so it wouldn't work.
Right.
So we had to find something else that did. What were you gonna say?
I was to use a concrete example. I think like to at least a noob like me, Sombra is a really good example of this. Where like at high levels of play, it's my understanding that she's fairly viable as a character.
I don't even know anymore. I've lost track of the meta there. But
well, anyway, for a while she was, and
Sure.
it's. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she's your best pick at lower levels because there's almost like a valley, right, of like skill where like you have to get a certain amount good before she's better than somebody who's just easier to use.
Right,
you have to
exactly.
be really, really good with Sombra in order for it to be the best option. Otherwise, it's not your best option.
Yep.
So having a gold version of a hero isn't necessarily as good as having even if it's the same comp as a platinum team or somebody who's challenger tier or whatever.
Which this discussion of the whole like execution versus strategy kind of makes me think of just what we were talking about. Like I was talking about, I just kind of off the top of my head called it skill stratification. The idea that at lower levels in general, you're going to have a much wider range of people will be a lot farther apart in skill levels, right? Sometimes even within the gold games. Sometimes we would look into a game where somehow we just matched with 11 other people that were worse than us, and Xander and I just wiped the floor.
Right.
At very, very top levels, that stratification becomes much, much thinner. Think the Grand Canyon versus like a small piece of granite where you can see, or like sandstone where you can see the really, really clearly defined little lines. And they're very, very minuscule, and they're very, very specific. And the difference between one another is actually very, very small. That's what happens when you get to those top kind of level professional, or even arguably the very, very top of the of ladders in like Grandmaster kind of realms for the MOBAs or for Overwatch or for shooters. You tend to actually run into the same people over and over again because that just is such a smaller amount of people that you can possibly play with, and hence that skill level is extremely close there. So it does come down to, at that point, I think less execution, because at this point, matchmaking doesn't matter as much, right? Like it's pretty darn clear that these people belong where they are. They're not going to be going up or down a whole lot, right? Like it's not like they kind of accidentally got into Grandmaster. It's not about securing even a 50-50 win rate anymore. I mean, I think that's almost impossible with a very small group of people where the difference isn't necessarily like inherent skill. Like a lot of them are going to be putting in inherent skill / time.
Right.
I think a big part of it at that point is sure. I mean, I think execution strategy level out a little bit more there.
Hmm.
if not even more on the strategic side or the understanding of meta side, or being able to find something in the current meta that you can exploit and then develop a new one, right? That's like the really, really top tier people that are like meta defining.
Right.
Um, and it's less about, and of course, like I said, there are players that are just known for their execution, but in general, I'd say in large part, a lot of people put in a lot of time, and that tends to equalize out more in terms of pure execution. I feel like execution is something that could be practiced and learned a little bit easier than like strategic sense or game sense.
Hmm.
That feels like a little bit more inherent or special or more difficult to train.
Well, it's certainly more abstract, right? Like if
Right.
you botch a, you're trying to get the jump on somebody and you totally mess it up. It's usually pretty clear like where you made your mistake of like,
Right.
oh, I like my aiming was way off, or I didn't, look around to make sure there wasn't anybody else in the room before I jumped this character, or something like that. Um,
Right.
Strategically, you're by definition almost you're thinking at a
Right.
high level, and it's a lot harder to get a sense of like, oh, we were out of position there, or we pushed that point too early. We should have, waited
It
for the
wasn't a
rest of
good
the
idea to
teams.
jump this guy, actually, even though I
Like,
got the kill, you know?
right, like, oh, I didn't see if Genji had his ult yet before we dove that point, or something like
Right.
that. Um,
Right.
and so, like, that's at a higher level. I think that's because the feedback is less immediate. It's just harder to learn.
Right, which you made a good point even in the show notes here that like that basically if the outcome is already predictable, I'll just read what you wrote. The outcome is already too predictable, then matches basically become superfluous, right? Like that point of it being tense and having like unpredictability to who's going to win is the reason people watch sports, right? If you always just knew who was going to win, this comes back to like in large part. I had over the weekend I put on Xander's my roommate's bachelor party actually, and part of it was a big LAN party where I had a bunch of his friends over and we got as many TVs and systems, and it was really fun. And had pizza and stayed up till 5. But another part of it was we did a Smash tournament within there, and we amongst the 10 guys who were there for the party, there was a very very clear like we didn't have to play the tournament, right? We could have seeded everyone and predicted almost every single match, and with maybe one or two slight deviations, it would have been literally the exact same every single time we played it out.
Hmm.
And it was fun to do because we were friends playing Smash, and that's what games are for. We were not trying to be competitive. That
Right.
being said, that would not be fun in a larger sense, certainly for people watching, trying to see the game at a very high level. And hence, that's why we actually have like professional sports and professional
Right.
gameplay.
And I think equally it's also why we have college sports, right? Like there are people who like college sports better than professional sports. And
That's always been weird to me.
if you want to know why, it actually ties into this discussion, at least for the most part. I mean, there's college allegiances and things like that that play into it.
Yeah.
But there are people who they like the so when you have a lower skill of execution and a higher strategy, your signal to noise ratio is very different, right? The strategy comes through a lot louder if your execution skill is pretty much taken care of. And some people really like the mix of it's some execution skill and it's some strategy, and they're sort of both competing for center stage. I would say that's
Yep.
more where you're at with college sports. Professional sports, I would say the execution is much higher. It's less pronounced, right? You're not waiting. You're not necessarily waiting for the other team to just make a mistake. You are hoping that your strategy is superior to theirs because you're both so rehearsed in what you're doing that the odds of you making an execution mistake are a lot lower. There's not much chance to capitalize on that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'd say it's for sure in general true. It's also interesting because there are different. I was just I think there's a level of that as well as I've been watching a decent amount of well, not even decent, a few a few games here and there of March Madness, and had been watching the Pistons actually somehow regularly before that, which is very uncommon for me. But I got a decent sense of the difference between the NBA and even the top college teams, and it is a very very different game in the way you play. With if just by definition suddenly you go from shooting like 20% at the 3-point line to like some closer to 40, that is inherently going to change the entire meta of the game. If everyone can do that, or not everyone, but like if across the board, that is far more likely that people are going to be shooting better. That is going to absolutely change the way that the game is played at a fundamental level.
Right.
So it's not just about like, hey, people can execute better, and so now it's going to be more strategic. It's going to be, no, the strategy as a whole is going to change because people can execute better.
Mm-hmm.
It's less. I think we've been viewing it sometimes as like it's one or either or, kind of like if
Yeah.
strategy goes up, then execution goes down. But I think it actually really plays into. I think it's more circular than that, basically,
Yeah, there's a
or like more a
relationship
z
between
axis
the
of
two.
it. Like they both will change each other.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I think that's absolutely true, and
yeah,
that's a good. That, I'm glad you pointed that out because I think we have been discussing it sort of as a duality. And
binary.
really,
Yeah,
yeah, it's they're very related, and
yeah,
you can strategically plan for bad execution, right? I mean, don't give the ball
yeah.
to the person who's not good, right? I mean, that's like at a
Right,
high
right,
level,
right.
that's like a way of strategically mitigating your
Moving around.
execution
Yeah,
problems,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so of course there's relationship there.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Totally.
you know, if the other team is
Or
almost
likewise,
perfect
right? You have
at
it. Yeah,
if the other team's almost perfect at doing free throws, then you want to
right,
avoid free throws, right? That's free
right.
points you're giving
Exactly.
them. If
Right.
they have a 50% free throw rate, then go ahead and foul Shaq because he's going to miss anyway.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Um, Interesting. I'm surprised. It's always interesting when we come to a point that we hadn't discussed in like real time, and we're like,
Yeah.
oh, well, now we should rethink everything we just talked. Let's see here. Want to talk about?
I think we could jump into
What's
talking.
sinusoidal? Oh, I see. As in terms of
Sinusoidal. Yeah,
sinusoidal. Yeah,
sinusoidal.
yeah, I see. The
So
idea
I wrote in our
of
notes
pattern building.
you want to have a sinusoidal sort of experience when you're winning and losing, which was some of what you were describing, where
Yeah.
you would be like you would win
Sinus.
70% of your matches in gold, and then you would
Right.
lose, maybe 40, you'd win 40% of your matches when you went up to platinum, and so
Right.
that's sort of this up and down that you're going to experience, but. And I think that's not a terrible thing, right? You want to be challenged and feel like you could get better, and you also want to have wins where you feel like I did it, I'm good.
Right, and that comes back to something my brother told me a very, very, very long time ago. My brother's 5 years older than me, and I always, play sports with him and games with him. And in large part, he would beat me, especially sports, obviously sports. But I'd always be frustrated, and because no one likes losing all the time. But I remember he told me this. Good Lord, I was probably like 5 or 6, but it seriously stuck with me. And this is just he's free life lesson for everyone. But he said you'll never get better if you don't play with people better than you,
Yeah.
which is just true. That's true across the board. You'll never get better at anything unless you're surrounded by people that are better, slightly, better at it. There's a level of you put a toddler with like MLB players, they're not going to be pitching 100. But but no, that's very true. Is that unless you are challenged, you in large part will not move forward. So I think there is an appropriateness of that point. What it does assume, however, is that people will push through that and actually improve, as opposed to getting disgruntled and stop playing,
Yeah,
or
that's
want to go
true.
back to playing for fun. The matchmaking system really does assume and necessitate competitiveness
Yeah.
to work in like almost any degree.
Which is not everybody's thing, and you could just say that,
No.
those people just shouldn't play those games. I think that's a little sweeping, frankly.
Well, yeah.
But
There's
yeah,
in-betweens.
there are definitely people who want to play. Like I would be in this category. I love MOBAs. I think they're really fun, and I like the team aspect and all the different strategic options there are. And I'm not good, and I've talked about this. This was actually the motivating. Incident or story from the very first episode, but like
Right.
just knowing that I really can't participate much in that culture because it is so competitive and I'm not.
Right.
But
Yeah, you are,
I would love to play.
by definition, boxed out a little bit. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, that's such a difficult. I mean, didn't you end up doing like a week where you tried playing League?
yeah. I did. Yeah, I got my
Just
ass
seeing how
handed to
people
me. It
responded
was just
to
yeah,
you?
yep.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how I
Well,
responded to
that was
other
also a
people.
conversation of culture. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and actually, we have a note on here about cultural components and metas. You talked about people who are meta defining and people who sort of hand down the best strategy to their community, basically.
Right.
They do something in a tournament and everyone's amazed, and then that becomes a big thing. And
Yep.
so
Try to
with
try to replicate.
right, and so with there's a within the culture of that game and that community that becomes really popular. However, I think that that can ignore the fact that people fit with strategies to lesser or greater degrees, right? So if somebody just the way that they play the game is very aggressive, that's their mindset. Is like they're looking for an opening, they're trying to get in there, they want to make things happen, they get bored quickly, and they want to execute. They're not going to be able to do this really elaborate turtling strategy that won a tournament, for example.
Right.
Um,
That's I'm sorry that I remember this. This is obviously not. Very few of our ideas are completely new ideas, but I remember day 9. It was actually one of the first. This was way back in the StarCraft 2. When StarCraft 2, still Wings of Liberty. It was close to like 2010, 2011, I think. It might have even been beta. But day 9 was talking about this, and specifically that kind of. I mean, obviously, when in high competitive play, when someone does something and people take note, then there is some level that you can adapt to that, or do it, or figure it out. Day 9 was mostly talking about low skill players watching like Slayer's Boxer, right? Who's arguably the best StarCraft player of all time, Brood War, one of the most successful, certainly the most famous. And people looking at him and watching a replay and then being like, I'm going to build 8 racks on, 2 bases because that's what Boxer did. And he's like, okay, 2 problems with that. 1, you're Mickey Mouse. 2, Boxer is not you. And anyway, point being exactly that there's a level of blindly interpreting strategy based on what good people do totally loses the nuance of why that's working for them or why it works. And that just being extremely, and that fuels a whole lot of balance questions, right? That's a whole kind of toxic thing that usually happens online that I try to stay away from nowadays. I used to be super into that, but in general, far lower skilled players will be judging the meta or the balance of the game. Particularly the balance is something dangerous to talk about because that feels more objective and matters more, based on extremely high skilled play, which is fine, but at the same time, there's usually a very deep misunderstanding of why those things are actually working, as opposed to a general rational discourse about like, hey, this thing might actually not be as good as we think it is, or no ever. It's all, hey, this thing came out and trashed everyone in this tournament, and so it's
it must be overpowered.
Yeah.
You see this sort of skill style fit in things like singing, right? That's a really great example. Like a good singer isn't just they've learned technically how to sing well. They've also had to go through the process of understanding their own voice and their own respiratory system and resonance structures so that they can use them to produce the noise that is most true to them and also, sounds good, you would hope. But it isn't just about getting technically all the ducks in a row. There is an acknowledgement of your own bodily structure. And I think neurologically that happens too. You have a neurological structure that you're leaning into always whenever you do any sort of anything strategic in a video game. And you want to try to learn a strategy or a play style that leans into and fits well with your neurological approach.
And arguably that is why you see, players that appear to be just leagues above other ones, is that there could be some level of just, for whatever reason, the way their mind works syncs perfectly with, the way this game was designed, and they just get it. And very often that's the way that, really elite players will talk about both games and sports, or even, math, or certainly art. Where they just see it and they get it and they can't quite explain it, and people can't quite touch them, and and that there's in the question of kind of meta defining stuff that actually came up from the fighting game community right now. A game that's actually kind of blowing up decently. It's pulling the unique thing about it is it's pulling people from all different levels of the FGC, but the Dragon Ball Z fighter. It's just called Dragon Ball Z Fighters, actually. is super popular right now. It's really fun. People are always going to be able to become competitive because it's so I don't want to say cartoony, but it's pretty darn simple, at least in terms of the mechanics of the game. And and so far it has. It's actually it had kind of its first successful major last weekend, and has pulled some huge names like from all over the world. And one of them was Sonic Fox, who's been kind of the dominant force in North American fighting games. Anyone he's touched really is kind of he started at NRS in terms of Mortal Kombat and Injustice, and has since dipped his toe into Marvel vs. Capcom and is really good at that. And is playing DBZ as well, and is literally hadn't dropped a game, I think, until last weekend, or maybe earlier this month. It was ridiculous. He'd had a insane run, right? And he went up against kind of the best player in the world, and from the East, he's Japanese, and they played an exhibition match, first to 10, and Sonic lost 4-10, which was a ridiculous. No one quite saw that coming. And then he met up with that guy again in the tournament, and I think it was grand finals, and then lost 3-2. So, and the interesting thing that happened there was, one, Sonic had a team. The game is team based, so you select 3 fighters, and you can, like Marvel vs. Capcom, and you can bring them in and out. And Sonic actually had a very unique team in terms of he played a character that almost literally no one else played, and most people didn't know what to do with. And the other guy, Goichi, had another team, in fact, that Sonic had derided part of. One character in particular he thought was pretty much worthless, and got put in his place and lost. And his response to this was to basically pick up Goichi's team, and not to necessarily play them, but the way he was going to figure it out was he was going to learn how to beat the team was to pick it up and play it. Right. So I feel like at that top level, the meta gets defined again, probably less binarily than we think. Like, hey, this person wins, and then everyone does that thing. I'm sure there's pieces of that, but I think what happens is this: people win, other people will pick this thing up and figure out what's good about it, or where you can exploit it. I guess what Sonic's trying to do is he's trying to find all the gaps in the team so that he can then beat it with his own, as opposed to just picking up the new one. Right. But I think it is a far more kind of give and take, and then that'll happen, and then Goichi will be able to evolve too, or maybe he won't be able to, and that means Sonic's a better player in that regard. It's interesting actually. So if they had met in the exhibition match, first Sonic took the first 3 games pretty decisively. He almost perfect Goichi in the first game, and then Goichi was able to download him, and then took 10 games to 1, So that's just a different type of skill, right? In some ways, Sonic had prepared better for it. But Goichi was better at adapting, and he was able to in real time figure out Sonic's team, and he murdered it. Like I said, if that had been a tournament, then Sonic would have won. Right. So it's very, very interesting. I think it is a more cyclical and give and take kind of thing in terms of that, like, meta definition at top levels, than just like, hey, this person wins, this is what's good now.
Well, it has to be, right? I mean, going back to the advice your brother had and what you said earlier, you can't get better unless you play against people who are better than you. Well, unfortunately, that starts to fall apart at very high levels because you are the best, probably, in some sense. And what you end up doing is you play against people who don't necessarily play better than you, they just play differently than you. And sometimes those differences result in wins. And so you can learn something from them, and you end up learning stuff from each other because you do things differently. And then you sort of advanced the discipline, if I can call it that, as a whole. You advance the discipline of playing this Dragon Ball Z fighter, and the whole community can learn along with you as you advance the discipline.
Yeah, totally, and that's I think that's the reason that games, and particularly games, because we have new releases. I mean, sports, you see that over longer periods of time, but as we say, you don't see a new release of football every other year, right? Where then everyone has to adapt to it. Well, I don't know. The NFL's been changing the rules slightly for the past never mind. That's different.
Well, to actually make another sports point, we talked about something earlier. This isn't really too connected to what we were just talking about, but it's relevant to stuff earlier in the episode. Me and Sam were. I just popped into his room. He's a big football or a basketball fan, and the game was down to like the last minute, and there was a certain point spread, and he went ahead and looked up what the odds were of his team winning at that point, because there's a site that gives you real-time predictions about the outcome of a match, and it was something like 99.4% win rate given the current point spread and possession and all of that. And he just turned off the game. He was like, yeah, we know who's going to win, so like let's go play Smash. And that ties back into what we were talking about, how if you're able to sufficiently predict an outcome of a game, it's not suspenseful anymore, and it's not that fun to watch. Like
You
if
don't even watch it, yeah.
right, if he knew that 994 times out of 1,000 this was going to play out so that his team won, he didn't need to watch the rest of the match. And I thought that was really interesting about how, as we get better predictive statistics on things like sports, that actually can start to decrease the enjoyment and entertainment value that people get from a game.
Huh, that is interesting. Did they win?
Yeah, they did. Yep.
Yeah, that's good. I thought it was going to end with, and then they lost.
No.
It was the best. It was the best. Upsets are that's something we could talk about in competition too. It's just like the idea of like upsets and why people love that so much, and underdogs.
Right.
It's been interesting for me. Going from, this is just a little bit aside. We're pretty much at the end of our time here, but like I said, Sonic Fox was so dominant in the fighting game scenes that I watched for so long I will say he makes it easy. He's a fantastically personable, fun, good guy. He's not full of himself. He's not a dick about it at all. So that makes it easy to root for. But at the same time, there is some level of, it does get boring watching a tournament knowing that Sonic is going to win every single time. And he almost literally did. It was insane. He was that level. And I was usually rooting for whoever's playing against him. And it would be really exciting when he got beat, which was really rare. But then this more speaks to just like some basic like tribalism stuff, which is fascinating. But then when I saw him go into DBZ and he was kind of representing the NRS scene against all these other scenes, in terms of like Killer Instinct and all the anime games, and people playing Tekken and people playing, there's a few, there's a major Smash player who was playing, Leffen was playing, and that no matter what, even though he still was kind of dominant at that point, I was rooting for him like every single time.
That is interesting.
Because he was like one of my guys, and I wanted to see him like do well. Despite the fact that, like I said, even in early DBZ, he was still at that point where he like didn't drop a match. And I like didn't care because he was beating people who I didn't know. So that's an interesting thing that we could talk about in terms of team loyalty or that sort of thing in the future, because that's just straight psychological.
Right, and different sorts
really
of
simple things
different sorts of fans. Some people will kind of root for the underdog no matter what, and some people will always root for their team no matter what. Whereas I tend to be more of the former. Like I honestly, even if it's a team that I feel I have some loyalty to, like U of M, like I'm a University of Michigan grad. I would much rather see a U of M game that was really close. Even if we lost, than one where we won. And I know
where we just murdered Air Force.
Yeah, like, and I know I'm in the minority, at least among people from Ann Arbor, in that
Certainly
regard. They would much rather win handily, and honestly, I just want to watch a close game. I'm there to be entertained, and I realize that that's not representative for sure, but it does highlight to me that there at some point can be a breakdown between what the audience wants to happen and what the competitors want to happen. Because the competitors want to win as best as they possibly can, right? Like, in real competition, there's no mercy rule. There's just kill, just get them, just do what you can. But from an audience standpoint, if somebody's just wiping the floor with somebody, like, I think you don't want to watch that. You have better things to do with your time. It's not interesting.
Yeah. I'd actually very often skip toward, like, I'd usually watch, like, in NRS tournaments, I'd usually watch, basically I wouldn't watch, like, the last three. I probably wouldn't watch, like, top 8. I'd as a top 8 that didn't have Sonic, but like by the end, by like certainly top 4, you knew who was gonna like. I basically just like make sure he won everything, and then not watch the end. Which is interesting in that like the like top 32 or pools of tournaments tend to be more fun for me to watch because there's more. I didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
Well, I feel like that basically comes to an end point here.
Yeah, I think so. I'm glad we were able to revisit this. You know, we haven't revisited many topics on this podcast, and this is one of our...
This might be the first one.
So this is one of our staples, though. This is a discussion we have a lot, just about the dynamics involved in making metas and in competition. So,
yeah, and that's kind of where this was all born out of. I mean, the whole podcast was in large part our plan was to be. I mean, that was where a lot of our conversations were going, and that's why we began having enough of them and dissecting that we decided that we were going to start recording it. So,
yeah, surprisingly, it was not. It wasn't that we had repeated discussions about the psychological impact of fear in video games, but...
which would, for a little bit there would have not been entirely clear.
Yes, if you go back and listen to our fear series in October, that's what we're referencing. That we did.
I think we did a very comprehensive breakdown of fear in video games, though.
We did. We're not gonna have anything to say this October, man.
I know, and it's October.
October 2018.
I don't know what
we're just gonna say Happy Halloween and go on like normal.
I know, or we do the complete opposite, and I know it's the complete opposite of fear. Like, we just do a run on dating sims.
Ooh, that'd be actually pretty interesting to talk about dating games. But anyway, cool. Well, we will brainstorm on our own time.
Yeah.
For those of you who are enjoying spring break or have recently enjoyed spring break, I hope that went well for you. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.